Sometimes pictures are the best way to understand an event that happened in history. And when we look at Reconstruction, our text does call it a failed revolution. And the former pictures that we've seen in other videos can kind of remind us why. We have an ineffective leader in Andrew Johnson acting as Iago from Shakespeare's Othello. Here he is, not leading newly freed blacks into the rights that they deserve. We have the political message, one vote less, a black voter. The goals of the Democratic Party, in this case, involving the trampling of black men and women and voter suppression. So, why did this revolution, which lasts from 1865 to 1877, why did it end? Is the focus of this final video to kind of recapture Reconstruction. This was again what our text called it in the beginning. How did it go? With a whole lot of confusion, it was the most promising, despairing, noble, awful, idealistic, reactionary, hopeless, and hopeful and hopeless time in all of American history, and it didn't end up very well. So let's see basically what happened. This major theme that we've had over and over is that rules can change. And we had that with the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which said that no state can deprive someone of life or liberty or property. But what about hearts and minds? What about the beliefs of ordinary people? We saw that Reconstruction legislatures, like the really cool one that we saw in South Carolina, voted for schools, bridges, railroads, etc., in an attempt to provide a new start for African Americans. This requires money, which is what our text called it too. And large landowners were still not compliant. So if a rule changes, are people going to follow it? We have to remember that in 1866 to 1877, known as congressional Reconstruction, we have, here's a picture of, again, a Union officer. If he was in blue, it would make more sense. They are all in the southern states complying that the people follow ahead with Reconstruction through force of means. But this brings up a really interesting question that text talks about. If this idea of blacks are equal to whites and that slavery is wrong, what had the Southerners actually fought for? What had the ordinary people, again, many of whom, if you were a Confederate soldier, odds are you weren't a slave owner. Maybe you didn't have anything to do with slavery, but what had the war been fought for? What had people lost their lives for? What had families who had lost loved ones? What was the purpose of the war, right? That's caused a lot of, again, these hearts and minds to not change. The text talks about it. The Southerners aren't. They're not angels. They're not devils. They're just ordinary people where slavery was the way of life for such a long time. It's what they grew up with. They thought it was normal. So what had they actually fought for? Naturally speaking, they're not going to be too keen on some of these rules, like the 13th Amendment or like the 14th Amendment. So when we go back to, again, turbulent times call for steadfast leadership, we had President Lincoln, who was this transformational leader who was assassinated. We saw that Andrew Johnson was an ineffective leader. And then our text actually talks about Grant being an ineffective leader, and it's true in part that his presidency was filled with corruption. But I disagree a little bit with the text saying that Grant was a completely ineffective leader. I read a book about him several years ago by Ron Chernow, which goes back to, again, it's important to have opinions about what happens in history. Our text says Grant was completely ineffective, but I disagree with that a little bit. But it was true that in part his actions led to Reconstruction's failure. So we have in the South this large demographic that, again, is not too keen on these new rule changes in this new society. So here's where Reconstruction ultimately ends. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes, who I do not have a picture of, won a fraudulent election in part by promising to withdraw federal troops from the South. Again, they are in almost all of these states, forcing compliance. But he won an election and basically said, I will remove the soldiers from the South if you vote for me. And the election was fraudulent. That can be another video. But now the Union troops are gone. So you can guess what's going to happen next. Southern states made it incredibly difficult for blacks to vote, among other things. The law maybe that in Alabama introduces, or Mississippi or Louisiana, remember, they have jurisdiction in those states, not in the rest of the other country, but in this state, the concept of federalism, right? Alabama can govern itself. Segregation becomes the norm in so many of the southern states. We see that it's illegal for blacks to go to school. It's illegal for blacks to sit with whites. It's illegal for blacks to marry whites. And segregation becomes the norm in much of the South. What about maybe the 13th or 14th Amendment or the 15th? Neither of those amendments were enforced. In Arkansas, for example, black lawmakers were literally forced out of the state. They had to leave. They were chased out by Southerners with weapons, and they had to flee north into other states. And that happened in a lot of the South, and there was violence as well, too. And then the KKK is going to continue to grow in strength in this part, too. Lynchings were common. Lynching is another word for just hanging someone without due process. It's murder. And in this case, you have a carpetbagger. It looks like someone from Ohio came down south. They were trying to help, but they were hanged as well, too. So this is the state of the South after Reconstruction. Without those federal troops, the laws like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were not enforced. Which brings us to the final concluding point. There's a terrific book called The Second Founding by Eric Foner, in which he writes about 1877 marked a decisive retreat, which is an important word in this context, from the idea born during the Civil War of a powerful nation state protecting the fundamental rights of American citizens. It was a retreat. So when eventually we will come back to trying to grant those greater rights to blacks in the country, but there was a pause and there was gradual loss of the idea that blacks should be free, that they should have the same rights as anybody else. And before it gets too kind of discouraging, because like I tell students, you should have opinions about history. Sometimes it should make you feel sad. It should make you feel happy. But it is kind of cool to think about. In the United States, this is the first country in the world that attempted a fair-minded interracial society, right? The demographics, the number, the racial compositions of whites and blacks is nowhere else is this kind of government being tried. It's not happening in Europe. It's not happening in Africa. It's not happening in South America, Asia. So this is the first place, really, where there's an attempt to make a fair-minded interracial society. So naturally, it's going to have a hiccup, I guess, to use a more simpler word for it. And that's what the end of Reconstruction was in 1877. So why we should celebrate the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, and the incredible gains that happened, in no way should it be declared a victory, right? The fight is still going on from 1863, which was when the Emancipation Proclamation happened, to 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King gave this speech. That's 100 years. So we saw that events had been set in motion, but they were not yet completely done yet, which brings us again to Gandalf. And even though The Hobbit was bad, it's these small everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love. So if this is what Gandalf is telling us is important, this titanic struggle is still going on today. So what role can we play? That's a question that I think deserves a lot of pondering, a lot of thought, and a lot of action in order to make the nation live up to its creed of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone.